It was one of those evenings that felt like something magical might happen, even if no one could explain why. The town's old concert hall glowed softly with golden lights, and people dressed in elegant clothes filled the room, talking and laughing as music played faintly from hidden speakers. The event was a charity gala, an annual gathering where business owners, artists, and families came together to raise money for local children's programs. Everything seemed perfectly planned, until the host received an urgent message that the main pianist, who was supposed to perform that night, had gotten stuck hours away due to a snowstorm. The host, a kind man but easily flustered, tried to stay calm as he made his way through the crowd. He didn't want the night to lose its rhythm. A live piano performance was supposed to be the highlight of the evening. Guests had been waiting weeks to hear it. Without it, the gala might lose its spark. In the corner of the room sat a grand piano, an old one but polished to perfection. It looked beautiful but lonely, as if it had been waiting all night for someone to wake it up. The host nervously stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone. The chatter slowly faded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, forcing a smile, "I'm afraid our scheduled pianist has been delayed due to weather conditions. But the show must go on, right?" He gave a short laugh that didn't quite hide his worry. "If anyone here knows how to play even a little, we'd love to hear you tonight. It doesn't have to be perfect, just something to keep the magic alive." There was a brief silence followed by a few polite chuckles. People looked at each other, but no one moved. Some shrugged. Others turned back to their drinks. Playing piano in front of an entire hall full of guests wasn't exactly something people volunteered for. At a small table near the back sat a woman wearing a simple black dress. Her hair was tied neatly and a soft scarf framed her face. She didn't talk much during the evening, only smiled when spoken to. She looked like any ordinary guest, quiet, polite, almost invisible. When the host made his announcement, she looked toward the piano, then quickly down at her hands resting in her lap. Her heart started to race. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not in front of people at least. The thought of it made her palms sweat. Yet deep inside her something stirred. It was that old familiar pull she used to feel whenever she heard those ivory keys call out to her. But she had promised herself she was done with performing. Done with the stage, done with the world that once lifted her high, and then broke her so painfully. Still, the silence in the room stretched on. The host looked more desperate by the second. He was about to step down and move on when a soft voice spoke from the back. "I can play a little," she said quietly. People turned their heads. Some smiled, relieved that someone had volunteered. Others looked curious. The woman stood up slowly. She wasn't wearing the kind of sparkling gown others had on, and her modest appearance didn't draw attention, but there was something calm and steady in the way she walked toward the piano. "Oh, that's wonderful," the host said, clearly grateful. "Please come on up. The stage is yours." She nodded politely but said nothing more. When she reached the piano, she paused for a second, placing one hand on the polished wood. The room felt unusually still, as if holding its breath. She sat down on the bench, adjusted it quietly, and let her fingers rest lightly on the keys. The host whispered something encouraging, then stepped back, unsure what to expect. The guests leaned in, some smiling, others smirking gently, thinking it would be a charming but amateur attempt. A few whispered things like, "Let's see how this goes," or, "She's brave, I'll give her that." The woman took a deep breath. Her fingers twitched slightly, testing the feel of the keys. The piano was slightly out of tune, but still rich, still alive. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered a time when playing felt like breathing, when the world around her disappeared, and all that mattered was the sound she created. She could almost hear her younger self again, full of dreams and fire long before life had silenced her music. Then she began to play. The first note was soft, almost uncertain. The second followed, blending smoothly with the first. Within seconds, a gentle melody started to form, slow and warm like sunlight touching the floor through a window. Conversation stopped. Even the waiters paused as they passed by with trays of glasses. It wasn't a showy tune. It didn't race or roar. It simply spoke quietly, honestly. Her hands moved gracefully, each motion full of care, as if she were telling a story she had carried for years. The host stood near the edge of the stage, his mouth slightly open. He didn't expect this. No one did. What began as a simple offer to fill a gap had turned into something else entirely. The woman's playing deepened. The music shifted into minor tones, more emotional, more personal. People in the audience began to feel it, not just hear it. It was the kind of music that reminded you of something you'd forgotten about yourself. A few closed their eyes. Others watched in awe, realizing that this wasn't the casual performance of someone who could play a little. This was the touch of someone who lived and breathed through her music. And yet, no one knew who she was. No one guessed that years ago she had been one of the most respected concert pianists in Europe, performing in grand halls and symphonies. Back then, her name had been printed on posters and programs everywhere. But that life had vanished overnight after a terrible accident, left her unable to play for months. The physical pain had healed, but her confidence hadn't. She disappeared from the stage, from interviews, from everything. To the world, she was gone. Now, sitting in that quiet hall, hidden behind a simple scarf and plain dress, she felt something return to her that she thought she'd lost forever. The melody grew richer. Her eyes stayed closed as if she were somewhere else, somewhere beyond the fear, beyond the years of silence. Each note she played seemed to release a piece of her past, turning pain into beauty. The crowd listened, utterly still. They didn't know the story behind the music, but they could feel it. The tune rose and fell like a heartbeat, alive and raw. It was the sound of someone remembering who they were. The host, now standing quietly to the side, noticed a few people wiping tears from their eyes. He had never heard anything like it. For a moment, it didn't even feel like they were in that hall anymore. It felt like the whole world had shrunk down to those notes, those hands, and the fragile, powerful soul behind them. When she finally let the last note fade, the silence that followed was almost as beautiful as the music itself. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. It was as if the room needed a few extra seconds to come back to reality. Then slowly the applause began. Soft at first, then louder, stronger, until the hall echoed with it. The woman opened her eyes, startled by the sound. She hadn't expected it. She stood slowly, gave a small, humble nod, and smiled shyly. The applause grew even louder. People rose to their feet, cheering for her as if they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The host stepped forward again, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was incredible," he said sincerely. "May I ask your name?" She hesitated, looking around the room filled with faces she didn't know. For a moment she thought about saying her real name, the one that used to mean something in the music world. But then she smiled gently and said, "Just someone who missed playing." The crowd laughed softly and clapped again, touched by her modesty. She stepped away from the piano, her heart still racing but lighter than it had felt in years. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel broken. She felt alive. As she returned to her table, people nodded and whispered, wondering who she might be. The host announced that the rest of the evening would continue as planned. But everyone knew the highlight of the night had already happened. No one could have guessed that the woman they had just heard was a legend hiding in plain sight. To them, she was simply a guest who had the courage to sit at the piano and play. But for her, that moment was more than courage. It was a quiet return to herself, a step back toward the life she once loved and thought she had lost forever. She sat back down, listening to the murmur of the crowd and the soft clinking of glasses. A small smile stayed on her face. The disguise had worked perfectly, but the music had revealed what really mattered. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that this was just the beginning of something unexpected. That night, as the gala lights dimmed and people began to leave, the piano still seemed to hum faintly, as if her notes had left a trace behind. It was more than a performance, it was a rebirth, though no one yet knew whose rebirth it truly was. The next morning, the quiet town woke up to a new topic of conversation. Everyone who had attended the charity gala the previous night couldn't stop talking about the mysterious woman who played the piano. People described her in different ways. Some said she was shy but elegant. Others said her playing felt like it came from a place beyond words. One man swore he'd seen tears in her eyes while she played. Someone else said he'd felt chills all over, as if the music had reached straight into his heart. No one knew her name. She hadn't stayed long after her performance. When the applause finally ended, she slipped quietly out of the hall, leaving behind nothing but the memory of her music. Even the host couldn't find her afterward. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But the story spread quickly. By noon, people were calling the local radio station, asking if anyone knew who the disguised pianist was. A short video clip recorded on someone's phone began to make rounds online. Though the video was shaky, the sound of her playing was enough to stop people from scrolling for a moment and just listen. Meanwhile, the woman herself sat by the window of her small apartment, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked calm, but her mind was still full of the previous night. She hadn't planned any of it. In fact, when she arrived at the gala, she only wanted to support the cause and quietly disappear when it was over. But somehow the piano had called her back. As she stared at her reflection in the window, she couldn't help but wonder what had changed inside her. For years, she'd avoided everything connected to music. After the accident, she couldn't face the stage again. The sound of applause used to bring her joy, but later it only reminded her of what she'd lost. It wasn't just the injury that hurt. It was the fear of never being good enough again. She had once been a star on the stage, known for her emotional performances and her unique ability to make people feel something deeper. Then during a concert tour, she slipped on stage and injured her hand badly. Doctors told her recovery would be slow, but they never guaranteed she'd regain full strength. Months passed, then years. She practiced secretly, but every attempt ended in frustration. The pain wasn't just physical, it was inside her heart. When she finally accepted that she might never return to her old life, she moved away from the city and started over quietly. She changed her appearance, even her way of speaking slightly, to avoid being recognized. She didn't want pity or questions about her past. She just wanted peace, and for a long time she found it. Until last night. Last night, everything she had tried to bury came rushing back. The sound of the keys under her fingers, the silence of the audience, the warmth of the applause. It all reminded her of who she used to be. She closed her eyes and smiled faintly. Maybe I needed that, she whispered to herself. A few days later, she went for a walk through the park. It was a cool afternoon, and the trees had started to turn golden with the early signs of autumn. She carried a small notebook, something she used to write thoughts or short pieces of music in, though she hadn't opened it in years. As she sat on a bench, two women nearby were talking. "Did you see that video from the gala?" one of them said. "That mystery pianist? People say she might be a famous musician hiding her identity." The other woman laughed. "Oh, come on. Why would someone like that show up at a local charity event?" "Still," the first one said, "I can't stop listening to that clip. There's something about it, it feels real." The woman sitting on the bench smiled quietly to herself. She didn't say anything, of course. But hearing strangers talk about her playing after so many years filled her with a strange mix of happiness and disbelief. Later that evening, she received an unexpected message from the gala's host. He had somehow gotten her contact information from the event's guest list. His message was warm and kind. "I wanted to thank you again for saving the night," he wrote. "Your music touched everyone. People are still talking about it. We'd love to invite you again for a small community event next month. No pressure, of course." She stared at the message for a long time. Her first instinct was to refuse. The thought of playing again in public scared her. What if she couldn't perform like before? What if people recognized her? But another part of her, the part that had come alive again that night, wanted to say yes. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she went to the corner of her apartment where her old piano sat, covered by a thin cloth. She hadn't touched it in months. Slowly, she lifted the cover. The keys looked a little dusty, but still beautiful. She sat down and pressed one gently. The sound echoed softly through the small room. Her fingers moved cautiously, finding familiar patterns. The melody that came out was uneven at first, like a forgotten language she was trying to remember. But soon it began to flow naturally. She felt her hands relax, her body lean into the rhythm. Hours passed without her noticing. When she finally stopped, the room was dark and her heart felt strangely light. The next morning, she wrote back to the host. "Thank you for your kind message. I'm not sure yet, but maybe I'll come." Days turned into weeks. During that time, she practiced quietly every evening. She didn't set goals or deadlines. She simply played for herself, soft melodies, fragments of old songs, sometimes even unfinished pieces she'd written years ago. Each note seemed to heal something small inside her, but she was still careful. She never told anyone who she really was. In her new life, she had a simple job and kept mostly to herself. No one there knew she had once stood under bright lights performing for thousands, and she preferred it that way. As the date of the community event drew closer, she started to feel nervous again. The thought of stepping onto a stage, even a small one, made her heart pound. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep hiding forever. When the night of the event arrived, the hall was smaller and humbler than the gala, but filled with warmth. Families sat with children, and the air smelled of baked bread and coffee. It was more casual, less intimidating. She sat quietly in the back, unsure if she would actually play. The host spotted her and smiled widely. "You came," he said with genuine happiness. "Would you like to play again? Just one song?" She hesitated, then nodded. "One song," she said softly. As she walked to the piano, the crowd clapped politely. Most of them didn't know who she was. They just knew she was the woman who had surprised everyone at the gala weeks earlier. She sat down, took a deep breath, and let her fingers touch the keys. This time the music came easier. It was gentle but full of hope, like the sound of morning after a long night. The children in the audience stopped whispering. The adults leaned closer. She played as if she were speaking directly to their hearts without words. When she finished, there was silence again, followed by smiles, then applause. The host came forward, shaking his head. "You make it look effortless," he said kindly. She smiled, not with pride, but peace. "It's not effortless," she said quietly. "It just feels right again." After the event, a few people came to thank her personally. An elderly woman told her the music reminded her of her late husband. A young boy said he wanted to learn piano because of her. Each word touched her deeply. That night, walking home under the soft streetlights, she realized something important. For years, she had been hiding because she thought her story was over, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe the music had been waiting for her, just like that old piano at the gala. When she reached her apartment, she sat down again at her piano. Her fingers moved across the keys slowly, forming a new melody, something tender and alive. She didn't write it down. She didn't plan it. She just let it happen. The fear that had haunted her for years felt smaller now. She knew she still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she didn't feel like running from her past. She felt ready to face it. And though the world didn't yet know her name, the sound of her music had already started traveling. Softly, quietly, reaching hearts that needed it most. It was as if life itself had given her another chance, disguised not as fame or recognition, but as peace. That night, the piano's soft echoes filled her small apartment again. They carried not sadness, but something brighter. Something that sounded a lot like hope. Days turned into weeks, and the woman's quiet life began to change in small, almost unnoticeable ways. The evening she played at the community event had left something behind inside her, a kind of spark that refused to fade. Every morning before going to work, she found herself sitting at her piano for just a few minutes. What used to be silence now became soft melodies drifting through her small apartment. She didn't play for anyone else. She didn't record or write anything down. She played because it made her feel alive again. Each note helped her breathe easier, helped her remember that she wasn't lost anymore. Sometimes she thought about the people at the gala and how they had looked at her while she played. There was no judgment in their eyes, only warmth. That night, something had changed, not just for them, but for her too. One morning, while she was at work in the small art center where she helped manage events, the director walked over to her desk holding a tablet. "You're not going to believe this," he said, smiling. "Look at this video. Remember that pianist from the charity gala?" Her heart skipped a beat. She pretended to sound casual. "Oh yes, I heard people talking about her." "Well," he said, "the video's gone viral. Over 500,000 views in just a few weeks. People everywhere are trying to figure out who she is. Some even think she might be a famous pianist who disappeared years ago." She froze for a second but forced a small smile. "That's amazing," she said softly. "Her playing must have really touched people." He nodded. "It did. You can feel her soul in the music." Then he chuckled. "Whoever she is, she should come back. The world could use more musicians like that." She smiled again, but her heart was racing. After he walked away, she opened the video quietly on her computer. The quality was low, but she could see herself clearly, sitting at the piano in that modest black dress, her face half hidden by the scarf. The camera had captured her hands, her movements, and the emotion that filled the room that night. The comments below were full of admiration. "I can feel every note she plays. This isn't just music, it's healing. She looks familiar." Could she be that pianist who disappeared years ago? She scrolled down slowly, her fingers trembling. It was strange seeing herself through the eyes of others. Strange, but also beautiful. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of her story. She felt proud. That evening, she went home and sat at her piano again. The sound of the keys was like a conversation between her and her past. She began to play something new, a melody that had been forming in her mind for weeks. It was gentle but strong, like a voice learning to speak again after years of silence. She didn't know that across town someone else was watching that same video, someone who knew her from the past. A man who had once been her mentor, the one who had trained her when she was young. He recognized her instantly, not just by her hands but by her style, the way she used pauses, the way she made silence part of the music. It was her. He didn't call the news or tell the press. Instead, he sent a short email to the art center where she worked. The subject line simply said, "If she's ready, I have a piano waiting." A week later, the director called her into his office. "I got an interesting message," he said with a curious smile. "A man named Mr. Bennett, apparently a well-known music teacher, wants to meet you. He says he thinks you have potential." She froze again. Her past had caught up to her. But instead of fear, she felt a quiet calm. Maybe this was supposed to happen. She agreed to meet him at a small music studio on the edge of town. The day she arrived, the air smelled faintly of old wood and sheet music. She hesitated at the door for a moment before going in. He was already there, sitting by the piano, older than she remembered, but his eyes were still kind. When he saw her, he smiled. "I knew it was you," he said softly. She looked down, a little embarrassed. "I didn't want anyone to know," she admitted. "I just wanted to play again without the weight of my past." He nodded slowly. "And you did. You played with more soul than I've ever heard. You don't need to hide anymore." She sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap. "I'm not sure I'm ready to come back," she said honestly. "The world has changed. I've changed." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You don't have to come back the way you left. You can start new. Music doesn't care about fame. It only asks for truth." His words stayed with her long after she left the studio. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing his voice, and beneath it, the faint echo of her own music. In the following days, she began visiting the studio every afternoon after work. Sometimes she practiced, sometimes she just listened to other students play. It reminded her of her younger years when music had been her world, pure and full of discovery. Her mentor never pressured her. He simply left the piano unlocked, waiting for her. And slowly she began to open up again. She played small pieces, short and delicate. Each time she touched the keys, her confidence returned like sunlight melting frost. One day, as she was finishing a piece, a young girl who had been watching from the doorway approached her. "That was beautiful," the girl said shyly. "Do you teach?" The woman smiled gently. "No, I don't, but I used to play a lot." "You should teach," the girl said. "You play like the music is alive." The words hit her deeply. She had spent years running away from the stage, thinking she had lost her gift. But now, hearing that from a child, she realized maybe her purpose wasn't only to perform, but to pass on what she had learned. Over the next few weeks, she started helping at the studio, guiding a few young students with the basics of piano. Her calm patience and gentle encouragement made the children love her instantly. She didn't tell them about her past fame. She didn't need to. What mattered was that they felt her heart in the music. Her mentor watched quietly from the back of the room, proud but careful not to interfere. One evening, after the last student had gone home, he said, "You see what happens when you stop hiding? You give something back. That's what music is for." She nodded, smiling softly. "Maybe this is where I belong now." But deep inside, another voice whispered, a small, daring voice that wondered what would happen if she played for the world again. A few days later, she received another message from the gala's host. "There's going to be a winter concert at the same hall," it said. "We'd be honored if you performed again. People still talk about your last piece." She read the message 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly. The thought of standing on that stage again filled her with both fear and longing. That night she sat at her piano for hours. The winter wind outside tapped gently against the window as she played. This time she didn't play an old piece. She started composing something new, something that told her story. The melody began softly, uncertain, then grew stronger, rising with emotion. It spoke of pain, healing, and rediscovery. When she finished, she sat there in silence, her fingers still resting on the keys. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, she replied to the host, "I'll play." In the days that followed, she practiced the new piece again and again. It wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. She poured everything she had into it, her years of silence, her fear, her hope. Every note carried a piece of her journey. Her mentor visited one evening and listened quietly as she played. When she finished, he said softly, "That's the most honest music I've ever heard from you." She smiled. "It's the first time I've played as myself." The night of the concert approached quickly. This time she wouldn't wear a disguise. She wouldn't hide behind a scarf or modest dress. She would walk onto that stage as who she truly was, a woman who had lost everything and found herself again through music. As she stood before the mirror the night before the performance, she touched the small scar on her hand and smiled gently. It no longer reminded her of failure. It reminded her of survival. Outside, snow began to fall softly, the world turning quiet and white. Tomorrow she would step back into the light, not as the person she once was, but as the person she was always meant to be, and somewhere deep inside her heart, the music waited, ready to speak again. The evening of the winter concert arrived quietly, covered in a soft layer of snow. The city streets shimmered under the pale glow of streetlights, and people hurried along in their coats, their breath rising like tiny clouds in the cold air. Inside the grand hall, warmth and excitement filled the space. The seats were nearly full, and the same piano from that unforgettable gala stood on the stage once again, polished and gleaming. Backstage, she stood near the curtain, her hands clasped together. Her heart was racing, but not from fear. This time it was from something else, something close to freedom. She had waited years for this moment without even realizing it. Her mentor stood nearby, calm and steady, his presence a quiet reassurance. "You don't need to prove anything," he said softly. "Just play like you did when no one was watching." She nodded, breathing slowly. The murmur of the audience faded as the lights dimmed. The host walked on stage, smiling warmly at the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Tonight we have a special guest. Many of you remember a remarkable pianist who performed here months ago, a mysterious woman whose music touched every soul in this room. Tonight she has returned. Please welcome her once again." The applause began softly, growing louder as she stepped into the light. Unlike the first time, she wasn't wearing a disguise. Her dress was simple but elegant, her face calm and open. She looked like someone who had stopped running, from the world, from her fears, from herself. As she walked to the piano, the applause faded into silence. She sat down slowly, letting her fingers rest on the keys. For a brief moment, she looked at the audience. So many faces, some familiar, some new. And then she looked at the piano, the same one that had brought her back to life. When she began to play, the sound was soft, almost like a whisper. The notes fell into the air, gentle but certain, like snowflakes landing on still water. The hall filled with warmth. Her piece wasn't one of her old performances from her career. It was something entirely new, something she had written from the heart. The melody started with a tone of sadness, almost like a memory of all she had lost. But as it unfolded, the music began to rise, full of strength and hope. It was as if she was telling her story through sound, the story of a woman who had fallen, disappeared, and quietly risen again. The audience could feel it. They didn't need to know the details of her past to understand. Every note spoke of pain that had turned into grace and silence that had turned into courage. Halfway through the piece, her eyes closed. The world disappeared. There was only the piano, her heartbeat, and the rhythm between them. It was no longer a performance, it was a confession. Every emotion she had buried for years was pouring out, finding its place in the music. The room was so quiet that even the faint sound of snow falling outside could be heard through the walls. People sat motionless, afraid to break the spell. Then, as she reached the final movement, the melody shifted again. Bright, tender, alive. It was the sound of renewal. Her hands moved with confidence now, no longer uncertain or tense. She was free. The woman who had once hidden behind a scarf in silence was gone. In her place sat someone whole, someone who had reclaimed her own voice. When the last note faded, the hall remained silent for a long moment. She lifted her hands from the piano, her breathing steady. her heart full. The stillness that followed was not emptiness, it was awe. Then slowly applause began. At first gentle, almost hesitant, then stronger. Louder until the entire hall was standing. People clapped, some with tears in their eyes, others smiling as if witnessing something sacred. She stood and bowed slightly, overwhelmed. It wasn't just applause for her playing. It was for her story, for her courage to come back, for the truth she had shared without saying a single word. The host came forward, his voice trembling slightly. "I think everyone here would agree," he said, "that what we just heard wasn't just music, it was a gift." The crowd agreed with another wave of applause. She smiled shyly and stepped back, letting the sound wash over her. It no longer frightened her. After the concert, she stayed backstage while people slowly left the hall. Her mentor joined her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said simply. She shook her head softly. "No," she whispered. "The music did it. I just listened." He chuckled, understanding exactly what she meant. Soon, a few people came to meet her, local journalists, music lovers, even students who wanted to thank her. One woman held her hand tightly and said, "Your music reminded me that it's never too late to start again." Those words touched her deeply. For years, she had believed her story was over, that her time had passed. But now she realized something beautiful sometimes. When you think life is done writing your song, it's only changing the key. Later that night, when the hall was empty and quiet, she returned to the piano one last time. She sat alone on the stage, the lights dimmed. She ran her hand gently along the keys and smiled. This piano had seen her pain, her fear, and her rebirth. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The sound of the wind mixed softly with the faint echo of her last performance still lingering in the room. She began to play again. Not the same piece, but something new, something calm and tender. She didn't need an audience now. The music was for herself. After a while, she stopped, stood up, and walked toward the center of the stage. She looked at the empty seats and whispered quietly, "Thank you." The hall, in its stillness, seemed to answer her with silence, a peaceful silence, like an embrace. The next morning, the story spread quickly again. News outlets wrote about the mysterious pianist who had returned. Some recognized her now, realizing she was the same woman who had once performed across the world. But instead of chasing her for interviews, people spoke about her with admiration and respect. Her music wasn't about fame anymore, it was about connection. She received letters and emails from people across the country. Some were from other musicians who had lost their way, others from ordinary people who had been moved by her story. They all said the same thing in different words. Her music had given them hope. She spent the next few weeks quietly, avoiding attention. But something had changed permanently inside her. She started to accept invitations, not big ones, but small gatherings, hospitals, community centers. She played for people who needed comfort, not applause. Each time she performed, she saw faces light up, eyes fill with tears, hearts soften, and with each performance, she healed a little more herself. One afternoon, while walking through the park where she had once overheard people talking about her, she sat on a bench and watched children playing near a frozen fountain. She remembered the little girl at the music studio who had told her to teach. She smiled, realizing that maybe her story wasn't about returning to fame. It was about passing on her gift. That evening, she returned to the studio and spoke with her mentor. "I think I want to start teaching," she said. "Not just piano, but what music really means, to feel, to listen, to live." He nodded, his eyes bright. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Together, they began organizing small classes for young students. Soon, laughter and music filled the studio every afternoon. The children adored her, not because she was once famous, but because she understood them, because she knew what it felt like to find light after darkness. As the months passed, her new piece, the one she had played at the winter concert, was shared online again and again. People called it the return, though she never gave it a name. To her, it wasn't about coming back. It was about moving forward quietly, honestly, one note at a time. Sometimes late at night, she still sat alone at her piano, playing softly while the world slept. The sound filled her small home with warmth. She no longer feared silence. Silence, she realized, was just another part of music, the part that made every note matter. And so, the once disguised pianist who had hidden from the world found her place again, not in fame or applause, but in the hearts of those who listened. Her story had begun in pain, grown through silence, and ended in peace. But her music, it would keep living, long after the final note had faded. The months following her winter concert passed quietly, yet the woman's life had changed in ways she could hardly have imagined. She still lived simply, walked the same streets, and drank her morning tea by the window as she always had. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt like a stranger in her own life. Music had returned to her, and with it came a sense of purpose she had long thought lost. Her teaching at the small music studio became the center of her days. Children came from all over, some shy, some bold, some reluctant, and each one brought a story. Some were curious, some were grieving, some were simply restless. She treated them all the same, gently, patiently, and without judgment. She didn't care about their skill level. What mattered was their willingness to feel the music, to let it speak. The students adored her, though none knew the full story of who she was or what she had endured. She preferred it that way. She wanted them to see only the music, not the fame or the past. She guided their fingers on the keys, taught them how to listen, how to pause, and how to let their emotions flow. She would sometimes play alongside them, letting her fingers dance over the piano with soft grace, and the children would watch in awe, not realizing that this quiet woman had once played on the grandest stages. One afternoon, after a long session with the students, she stayed behind alone in the studio. The room smelled faintly of wood and old sheet music. The late sun cast warm streaks across the floor. She sat at the piano and allowed herself to play without any thought. The notes came slowly at first, hesitant, and then with increasing certainty, like a stream finding its path through rocks. As she played, she remembered the night of the gala, the hush in the hall, and the quiet gasps of wonder when the first notes fell. She remembered the winter concert, the standing ovation, the eyes of the audience reflecting both surprise and recognition. She had walked away from fame once, believing it was too painful, too demanding. Yet now she understood that her journey wasn't about applause, it was about honesty, about connection, about giving a piece of herself to others in a way she had never fully allowed before. The following week, she received an invitation she hadn't expected. A small cultural foundation in the city wanted her to perform a short recital, not for competition, not for accolades, but simply to inspire. She hesitated. Performing in front of strangers again brought memories of fear, doubt, and the accident that had once stolen her confidence. But there was another feeling, stronger than hesitation, excitement. The thought of sharing music once more, of giving it freely, made her heart flutter. She agreed. The recital wasn't far off, and she began preparing. But preparation this time was different. She didn't focus on perfection. She focused on honesty. Each note she played was a conversation between her and the piano, between her and the audience, between her and herself. She practiced melodies she had composed during quiet nights at home, and as she played, she felt layers of worry peel away. On the day of the recital, the hall was small, intimate, and filled with people who genuinely wanted to listen. She walked in quietly, nodded to the host, and sat at the piano. When she placed her hands on the keys, she felt no fear, only the quiet thrill of being alive, of finally returning to what she had always loved. The first notes fell gently, soft like a sigh. The music built gradually, flowing in waves that carried both sadness and hope. Some people in the audience closed their eyes, letting the sound reach them. Others leaned forward, enchanted by the clarity and depth of each movement. The woman played with all the care of someone speaking a deeply personal truth. She didn't perform for recognition. She played because the music demanded it, because her soul needed it, because the audience deserved to feel it. Halfway through the recital, she paused. Her fingers hovered above the keys as she took a slow, deliberate breath. In that quiet moment, she realized how far she had come. Years ago, she would have been terrified of such silence, but now she welcomed it. Silence was no longer empty. It was part of the music, part of her own story, part of life itself. When she resumed, the melody swelled with confidence and warmth. It spoke of resilience, of rediscovery, of the joy in small moments. It told a story without words, but every person in the room understood it perfectly. They felt the emotions she had held inside for years: fear, grief, doubt, hope, and finally, courage. By the time she reached the final notes, the hall was completely silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even a whisper. The sound hung in the air, lingering in every corner, filling the hearts of those listening. Then the music faded, leaving only quiet reflection. The applause that followed was gentle at first, then grew steadily, honest and heartfelt. People stood to show their appreciation, not for a celebrity, but for a woman who had given them something rare and true. She stood, bowed lightly, and allowed herself to smile without hesitation. This was not the nervous, uncertain smile of someone hiding behind a scarf. It was a smile of someone who had returned to herself. After the recital, several people approached her to thank her personally. A young teacher said, "Your music reminded me why I became an educator in the first place. It's about connecting with hearts." An elderly man told her, "I haven't heard something so pure in decades. Thank you for reminding me of hope." Even the children who had come with their parents looked at her with wide eyes, full of admiration and wonder. That night, walking home through the quiet streets, the woman realized how much had changed in her life. She no longer feared being recognized or judged. She no longer doubted her abilities or her worth. Music had returned not as a burden, but as a gift, one that she could share freely without expectation or fear. The next morning, she received a letter from a young student who had been inspired by her performance. It read simply, "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to follow your heart. I want to play like you someday." The words touched her deeply. In that moment, she understood that her journey was no longer about herself alone. She was part of a larger story, one that included everyone she could inspire through her music. She began spending more time with her students, helping them compose small pieces, encouraging them to perform in local events, and teaching them not just about music, but about courage, patience, and the joy of expression. Each day she saw progress, small victories, and moments of pure magic. And each day she felt her own heart grow lighter, filled with the quiet satisfaction of living her purpose. Months later, the woman received a quiet invitation from a music festival in a neighboring city. It wasn't a high-profile event, but it promised an audience that appreciated the soul of music. She accepted. This time she wasn't anxious. She wasn't hiding. She had learned to trust herself, to let the music lead, and to find joy in the act of giving it away. On the night of the festival, she played a selection of her compositions. The audience listened, captivated by the depth and honesty of her music. When she finished, the applause was overwhelming, but she no longer measured her worth by it. She had already won in the most important way, by reclaiming her voice and her life. Afterward, she walked out into the cool night air, listening to the distant hum of the city. She thought about the journey she had taken, from the fear and isolation after her accident, to the timid first notes at the charity gala, to the confident, heartfelt music she now shared. Every step had been necessary. Every struggle had shaped her. And now finally she was free. That freedom wasn't just about performing or recognition. It was about knowing that she could face life, embrace its uncertainties, and still find beauty. It was about understanding that the music she carried inside wasn't dependent on anyone else. It belonged to her, and through her it belonged to the world. In the quiet moments that followed, she often returned to her piano alone. There she explored new melodies, improvised, and allowed herself to dream again. The music had become a companion, a teacher, a friend. It reminded her that life, like music, was full of unexpected notes, pauses, and harmonies. And even when things seemed broken, it was possible to find rhythm, beauty, and meaning once more. Years later, people would remember her not as a mysterious pianist who disappeared and returned, but as someone who lived with honesty, courage, and heart. Her story became quiet legend, not for fame, but for the way she touched lives through her music. Her performances were no longer just events. They were experiences, moments of connection that reminded people of their own emotions, hopes, and dreams. And she, the woman who once disguised herself to hide from the world, finally understood that music had never abandoned her. It had been waiting patiently through every lonely night, every fear, and every tear. All she had to do was return, and in doing so, she found herself again. Her life became a delicate balance of teaching, performing, and composing. She traveled occasionally to small festivals, always careful to keep her life simple. She built a community around her music, one where authenticity mattered more than applause, and each time she sat at the piano, whether for one listener or 100, she felt the same quiet thrill, the joy of letting her heart speak. and the peace of knowing that she had truly come home. Through all of it, she learned that courage wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about taking one small step after another, even when fear whispered to stop. It was about trusting that your voice mattered, even if only for one person at a time. And it was about remembering that in the end, the music always finds a way to reach the hearts that need it most. Her story, like her music, became timeless, not because it was loud or famous, but because it was honest, gentle, and real. The woman who once hid from the world had finally stepped into her own light, and with each note she played, she reminded the world and herself that it's never too late to begin again, to rediscover joy and to let your heart speak freely, without fear. The piano waited patiently, always ready, and she knew that as long as she returned to it, the music would never end.